the fact that the hard left has become so ensconced in identity politics. I know that you obviously got into a very well-publicized exchange with Ezra Klein at Vox over this, in which I thought he was...
Wasn't that fun?
I thought he was deeply intellectually dishonest. Shocker.
Yeah,
but I thought it was deeply intellectually dishonest. And then his suggestion that you were saying identity politics is bad is in and of itself a form of identity politics.
Right.
What do you make of this whole identity politics rising tide, and what do you think the backlash to that's going to be? Where is it coming from?
Well, it's coming mostly from the left. I mean, it's producing a counter effect on the right, which is white or even white male identity politics. And so it's natural to see that these two sides are amplifying one another. But on the left, it's much more troubling for me because the left is the space traditionally where self-criticism and wondering whether or not you might be wrong is just a paramount virtue, right? And so that has metastasized in this context to a kind of just shattering of epistemology where, on some level, there's no such thing as truth, there's just power, right? We're just responding to differences in power. And all of this is anchored to unchangeable characteristics like skin color and sexual preference. And so it's just, I now often describe this as just the most unhappy game of Dungeons and Dragons that ever was invented. I mean, you have to negotiate these power differentials based on victimology. How many victimology points you have in this game, and as a white, privileged, heterosexual, you basically have no points, right? So you're not empowered to have a credible opinion on any of the most important topics of our time, right? You're either just part of the problem with respect to all of these variables, and you're mansplaining or your cultural appropriation or your wading in here. I mean, so this is what happened with Ezra Klein. At one point, he said, we're two privileged white Jewish guys who shouldn't be talking about race at all, right? Like this is not something we can weigh in on. And then when I changed the topic to anti-Semitism, it got no better for some reason. But it's a problem because, clearly, if we want to get to a post-racial society, if we want to get to a society where human beings can simply be identified as human beings, the end game can't be taking things like race and gender and gender difference and sexual orientation immutably seriously, right? These can't be just the ineradicable variables that define a person's position on important topics for all time. We're not if we get to Mars and we're still worried about skin color, right? In a Martian colony, we've done something wrong. And so I think we need to reverse engineer what we think the end state should be, and clearly identity politics is not the game we should be playing.
Agreed. And I mean, obviously, it's destroying the capacity to even have these conversations, because there's no way to have a conversation with someone who is spending the entire time assessing whether your point of view is even worth being taken seriously, as opposed to the rational nature of what you're saying. And I think that's one of the factors I think that's unifying those of us who are having these conversations. I think another factor that's unifying all of this is a belief in data. Now, I know that you obviously are a deep believer in data and science. I'm quite fond of data and science myself, although you would argue, obviously, that as a religious person, I'm not fond quite enough of data and science, and we'll get to some of that in a little bit. But it seems to me that one of the downsides of the identity politics is the attempt to paint into a corner science as though science is an outgrowth of a particular culture and is therefore irrelevant to general swaths of people. So in the Ezra Klein interview, for example, when you suggested that group differences in IQ exist, and you weren't even saying that those group differences in IQ are attributable to environment or genetics. You were saying, we don't know the answer to that. If I don't want to mischaracterize your view. And he was immediately coming back with, well, you can't say that. I mean, I'm not sure how we're supposed to have conversations when you legitimately can't cite data before you even start having a conversation.
Yeah. And so, in defense of people who worry about this kind of thing, it's obviously possible for data to be wrong, and the conversation continues even once you have data. But what we should all be anchored to is a good faith, intellectually honest, non-smear merchant approach to analyzing what we think we know and why we think we know it. And those principles of rationality and an empirical engagement with reality simply are not susceptible to an identity or even a political interpretation. I mean, this is why reason is the only thing that scales. I mean, if I have a good enough argument based on clear enough evidence, it should persuade you if you are being reasonable, no matter what your background, no matter who your parents were, no matter how you were mistreated or not as a child. If we build a reasonable robot, it should be persuaded by the right arguments and the right data. So rationality is the mode of argument where it doesn't depend who you are in order to reach the right answer. I mean, this is why prototypically reasonable or reason-based topics are so easily divorced from politics and things like mathematics, right? Anyone who's going to argue that mathematics or philosophical logic is just a tool of political ideology and oppression that just knows nothing about those topics. But it's true that virtually every other place that we really care about facts and being right or wrong has that character. It should be true ultimately of journalism. It's either Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy or he didn't, right? It's a fact about a human being holding a gun, right? And we either get access to the data or we don't. So the fact that so much of our discussion about what's going on in terrestrial reality is based on or is filtered through the lens of people's political commitments is just highly dysfunctional. It's just not something to be maintained. We should be cutting through it wherever we can.